Shawna Benoit here, and today we're going to go over the F316 lead-based paint disclosure. And of course, this is to be filled out by the seller prior to going under contract. So you would initial or number your exhibit here, the property address here, and this is federal law. So under federal law, this exhibit must be signed by the seller and buyer, and the buyer provided with a copy of the lead-based paint brochure to the buyer and seller entering into a binding agreement. This agreement must be filled out for all housing built before 1978. Hazard lead warning. Every buyer of any interest in residential property on which a residential dwelling was built prior to 1978 is notified that such a property may present exposure to lead from lead-based paint that may place young children at risk of developing lead poisoning. Lead poisoning in young children may produce permanent neurological damage, including learning disabilities, reduced intelligence quotient, behavioral problems, and impaired memory. Lead poisoning also poses a particular risk to pregnant women. The seller of any interest in residential real property is required to provide the buyer with any information on lead-based paint hazards from risk assessments or inspections in the seller's possession and notify the buyer of any known lead-based paint hazards. A risk assessment or inspection for possible lead-based paint hazard is recommended prior to purchase. Seller's disclosure. A. Presence of lead-based paint and/or lead-based paint, initial number 1 or number 2. Number 1, known lead-based paint and/or lead-based paint hazards are present in the home, and then the seller would explain. Check box if additional pages of explanation are attached. Number 2, seller has no knowledge of lead-based paint and/or lead-based paint hazards in the housing, and they will initial there. B, records and reports available to the seller, initial 1 or 2. This section not initial shall not be part of this exhibit. Seller has provided the buyer with all available records and reports pertaining to lead-based paint and/or lead-based paint hazards in the housing list below. Or number 2, seller has no reports or records pertaining to lead-based paint and/or lead-based paint hazards in the housing. Buyer's acknowledgement, initial all applicable sections below. C, buyer has received copies of all information, if any, listed above. D, buyer has received a pamphlet, Protect Your Family from Lead in Your Home. E, buyer initials 1 or 2. Received a 10-day opportunity or mutually agreed upon period to conduct a risk assessment or inspection for the presence of lead-based paint and/or lead-based hazards prior to buyer being obligated under the purchase and sale agreement. Or 2, buyer waived the opportunity to conduct a risk assessment or inspection for the presence of lead-based paint and/or lead-based paint hazards, which shall not prevent buyer from evaluating the property for lead-based paint and lead-based paint hazards during any due diligence or right to request repairs, period. Agent's acknowledgement. Seller's agent has informed the seller of the seller's obligation under federal law and is aware of his or her responsibilities to ensure compliance. Buyer's agent has informed the seller of the seller's obligation under federal law and is aware of his or her responsibilities to ensure compliance. Required if the buyer's agent received compensation from the seller, either directly or indirectly through a cooperative brokerage agreement with seller. Here, the buyer would sign. The seller has probably already signed because the seller signs first. And then the buyer's agent signs, and then the seller agent signs. And this concludes the F316 lead-based paint disclosure. Thank you.